Hi everyone, just putting together this video for you to help you with your analysis of the poem When We Two Parted for the AQA English Literature exams. And we're going to begin by talking about the star of the show. So it might seem like this boring poem that was written hundreds of years ago by some boring old guy that no one cares about, but actually we really need to talk about Lord Byron, because I think there's quite a misconception there that he was boring, because quite frankly he was the furthest thing from boring. Think about every glossy magazine that is on every shelf when you step into a supermarket or a newsagent's at the moment. If Lord Byron were around today, he would be plastered across the front cover of every single one of them. He was rich, he had a wild lifestyle. I mean, think rock star legend of poetry, and that was him at his time. He dated many women. Many of them were actually wives of other men. Very famous. Is a man kind of with quite a tainted reputation. The women that he dated that were married were often married to quite powerful men, and his lifestyle was controversial, to say the least. And rumour has it that this particular poem is about the one woman that he fell in love with that he couldn't have, because they dated in secret and he fell in love with her, but she actually ended up marrying Lord Wellington. He was the most famous man in England at the time. He'd just won the Battle of Waterloo, and she basically got rid of Byron and swapped him in for Lord Wellington. A very advantageous marriage for her, and potentially a very broken heart for Byron. And many people believe that this poem was written about his feelings about that breakup. So one of the most important things we have to think about with poetry is the way that it sounds. So as I read the poem aloud to you in a moment, I'd suggest maybe just jotting down 3 words that you'd use to describe the way you think the narrator's feeling. When we two parted in silence and tears, half broken-hearted to sever for years, pale grew thy cheek and cold, colder thy kiss. Truly that hour foretold sorrow to this. The dew of the morning sunk chill on my brow. It felt like the warning of what I feel now. Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy fame. I hear thy name spoken and share in its shame. They name thee before me, a knell to mine ear. A shudder comes o'er me. Why wert thou so dear? They knew not I know thee, who knew thee too well. Long, long shall I rue thee, too deeply to tell. In secret we met, in silence I grieve, that thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. If I should meet thee after long years, how should I greet thee? With silence and tears. Did you make your list? Pause the video. Go back to look at the copy of the poem and just jot down next to each of your words which particular line conveyed that to you, so that you've got it for a little task later on. I mean, look at the language in this poem. It is ripe for the picking for analysis. Start by thinking about all the words in the poem that link to death. Take a look at words such as pale, cold, knell, that's a funeral bell, and grieve. They could very straightforwardly mark the end of a relationship, but it also reflects that process of him grieving for someone who he's lost from his life. It emphasises that there's an emptiness in him, that he's got a longing to connect with somebody that he just can't have access to. And the pain that the narrator feels about that is apparent the entire way through the poem. Look at the violent tone of verbs like sever in the poem. It's linked in my mind to something being ripped or painfully removed. It sounds aggressive, and it makes it appear forced too. Perhaps that's him conveying that actually he doesn't want this separation, that she's being ripped from him and he can't get her back. There's also that refrain. When we're talking about a refrain in poetry, we're talking about a repeated line, and the refrain here is silence and tears. Many people make the mistake, I think, of just saying, oh well, the poet uses repetition to emphasise something or to emphasise it. Yes, but pause for a moment and build your own personal interpretation of that text. What exactly do you think he's trying to emphasise with that refrain? Why did he choose that line, and why did he choose to repeat it in the first stanza and the last stanza? I'm not going to give you an answer to that one. I'm going to ask you to think about it personally. Remember also that if you're pushing for those top grades, you need to think about the structure of the poem as well as the language. And by structure, we're talking about the way that it's put together. Firstly, the thing that I notice about the structure is that it's got a circular narrative, and that means that it starts and ends in the same way, so it kind of comes back to the beginning. And that's with that notion of silence and tears, that's through the refrain. To me, it's almost as if that means that that pain that he feels now is always going to be present. He might accept that she's gone. He might continue and move on from it, but he's never going to be able to completely get over the fact that he's lost that relationship. It's going to be a part of his life forever. And as the poem progresses, the narrator also takes the reader through time with him. So look at the first stanza, and we're in the past there, where he's talking about their breakup and the way that they were, the fact that they met in secret. Then we move into the present, where he is thinking about her, and he's at a dinner party and everybody's talking about her, and they don't know that he was obviously in love with her, or that he was seeing her behind their back. And then we move into this idea of him considering the future, what he's going to do if he encounters her again, how he's going to handle that confrontation. Why did he use all three tenses? I think it supports that earlier argument. This is something that's going to remain. This is a significant life experience for him. It's something that is going to be part of every decision he makes, or every relationship that he has. And if they're moving in the same circles, there's perhaps that bit of paranoia that he's never going to really escape her, because what if she just appears in front of him? He has to have a plan of how he's going to approach her, and if he's having to plan it and he's having to think about it in advance, that highlights kind of the depth of that hurt as well, doesn't it? That he needs to have a fake response ready so that he doesn't show her the real pain underneath if they encounter each other again. And that's a significantly different tone to the start of the poem. Look at the use of that phrase, half broken-hearted. I'd put forward the argument that I think at the beginning it's almost as if A, he can't believe that this is over, but B, there's a little bit of hope there that she's going to come back. Half broken-hearted, I mean, the word half, that means he's not really accepted that it's over. He's not really taken that heartbreak seriously. Is he holding on to some kind of fake hope at the beginning that actually she's going to realise that that's a mistake and that she'll return? And that when he sits at that dinner party later and he hears them talking about her in a new life, he realises that this is actually over, and that he has to confront the fact that she will not be part of his life anymore. As always, I hope that those notes from Mrs. H Educates have enabled you to begin to make some useful revision notes. And now it's time for you to have a think about the rest of the poem on your own and build that personal interpretation. So these videos should just be a starting point. You should be using them to spark your own ideas. Go away and examine the poem by yourself. Examine that use of pathetic fallacy in the second stanza. That's where the weather's used. Think about why he's using that particular type of weather. What effect does it have? You could also think about the inclusion of that rhetorical question as he starts to consider the future. Or select anything else in the poem that you think is important. If when I read it to you, you notice something I haven't mentioned, it's significant and it's your personal interpretation, so make a note of it. What effect do you think it has? What would you say if that poem came up in the exam? And you could return to your list of 3 words that you wrote down earlier and the 3 lines that you wrote next to them and think about how those lines support your idea and which words conveyed that tone to you. Further revision materials, including key quotation cards for all of your texts, can also be found at the website www.mrseducates.co.uk. Thank you.